guys, thanks for joining me again today. So, today I'm going to be talking about images that are inspired by light, meaning images that the whole idea or concept for creating them was based on the environmental light. It was what gave me the direction I needed to be creative and create the image the image I ended up creating. So, I'm going to start with this one. I basically pulled a bunch of images from my gallery, and I don't necessarily have an order in which I'll be going through them. I'll just be, going through the slideshow and talking about them individually and basically going over the inspiration and basically my approach and direction and all that kind of stuff. So this one is from a maternity session. This was done in the Gallery of Arts in DC, one of the buildings, and the inspiration for this image was solely driven by the light in this space. We were on one of the levels of the building, walking through, and we had done a bunch of pictures. And as we were leaving, there was this really harsh. She was backlit, right? And from the window, there was this really bright light coming from outside. The sun, and it was reflecting really, harsh on the floor, and it was like concrete, concrete floor, and you see the vertical lines. That's shadows from the windows. The I don't know what it'd be called. I guess the metal bars in the windows, and that created those long diagonal shadows. So as I saw that, I was like, oh man, that's really cool. That's like a perfect opportunity to do a silhouette photo, with some with an interesting backdrop with leading lines and all that kind of stuff, because the shadows created those leading lines. So I made sure I lifted my camera up to get just the ground behind her and have those lines diagonal, so I could, have a clean background and also create a background that, when it's kind of abstract. So when someone is viewing this image, they don't necessarily know what they're looking at. As far as the background is concerned, they don't know how that was achieved. They can't really tell. It's pretty abstract because it's the floor. But with the lights and the lines, you're kind of confused about how it was created. So that's what I did. That was the first photo, because this is actually a double exposure. The second photo, or the second exposure, is the bokeh balls you see in the foreground. That was Anyone who's familiar with that building knows there's like a light tunnel, where light, like kind of like LED lights, are like flowing and moving through the scene. And I just like did a wide open shot with that, with like maybe a 58 or 85, probably a 58, just to get the bokeh balls. And then it was a double exposure. But the whole concept and idea behind this photo came from seeing the floor, seeing the ground, and seeing the light bouncing off the floor. And then that whole idea inspired the image. So, like my inspiration from, I think I've said this before, like majority of my inspiration comes from environmental factors. Like whatever is around me inspires what I create. So I never go out knowing what I'm going to do. I just leave it to the space to kind of talk to me and help give me these ideas for interesting looking images. And I think that's what allows me to be versatile. Like it's hard to dream up images that you manufacture from the ground up every day and do something different, right? But if you are going to different spaces and those spaces kind of dictate the kind of images you make, it makes it so much easier to come up with new things, because those spaces are kind of telling you what to do, or at least, giving you some inspiration or guiding you along the way on things to try and do. So that was the inspiration for this image. I'll see what the next one is. Okay, I like this one. So this one, um, several things inspired this. This was a photo of I think a fisherman in Cuba, and he was fishing through the hole in the ground. I think it was like on a pier, and that place had had broken off, and he basically was casting his line through there and fishing. And if you see in the bag on his left side or right side actually, left side of the image, his right side, you see a bunch of fish that he's caught. Um, so what several things inspire this image, but the lighting again, and in this case, the shadow. Um, I saw him sitting there casting his line, and I liked that the it was he was doing for one he was doing something interesting. Um, and that's one thing you do when you're shooting street photography. It's always a good idea to look for people doing interesting things. So he was fishing, but beyond that, I'm like, how can I create this photo? How can I create this photo in a way that is interesting and not just a guy sitting on the floor fishing, right? So for one, first step, I looked to the light. What was the light telling me? The light was suggesting that, you know, I could approach it in several ways. It was what was cool about it was his shadow was actually, kind of in front and not behind him. Um, and I decided that okay, I for one I like shooting with clean backgrounds, so the backdrop here is the ground again, something I use a lot. So I made sure I was able to shoot with the background, shoot the ground, and incorporate his shadow. So it's almost like you see his human half, and the shadow is like the complete kind of tells you what he was doing. Now, granted, it's not a perfect shadow in the sense that it's not perfectly formed where you get all the details of what's happening. You don't see his you can tell he's wearing a hat. It's not a very clean human form, but had it been, it would have been even better, right? So the idea is that was the inspiration for this image, and had it been a different time of day and a different angle of the sun or something, maybe the shadow would have been formed better. But I think overall you get the idea, and that's where the inspiration and for this image came from, was really just how the shadow fell in the frame and allowed me to do something like that was slightly different from the typical picture. And you generally see stuff like this done in engagement photos and stuff, or portraits of couples where you see the hands of the couples or their feet, but you see their heads kissing, and you kind of get, you tell, okay, they're kissing, even though you see just a portion of their bodies. But that's one of the cool things about photography is when I talk about photography, I like to talk about photography as just photography and versus only wedding photography or only portrait photography. Photography is photography, and the ideas from one genre of photography can transfer into the other. You can approach several things you shoot similarly. So I like to do that because I feel like you can learn how to do other things. You can learn how to do something for one thing by shooting it somewhere else. So I like to I like to take my ideas between all the the different things I shoot. Here's an image I made in California, Venice Beach, during a basketball game. Again, it was really sunny day, and this was during a workshop that we were doing in LA. We were in Venice Beach, and we were taking pictures, and it was during a basketball game. And for me, I could have shot this as a basketball game, and had the just pictures of the players playing and shooting in the hoops and doing all of that. But for me, I'm looking at light, I'm looking at color, I'm looking at shapes and stuff. So I figured, how can I take a mundane basketball game and turn it into a piece of art, and not necessarily have the image be about the fact that they're playing basketball, but use them as subjects in an abstract photo that I'm trying to make. And that's generally how I approach street photography. Is I try to use subjects on the street to create pieces of art that are not necessarily about the subjects or what they're doing, but a way for me to kind of obscure reality and use it to just create something colorful and interesting for viewers to see. So I really just focused on their body language, their the lines, the colors, and the movement. And I actually flipped the image upside down, so it's their actual legs are at the bottom and the shadows on the top, because that's really what this image was about, was just how the light was hitting and the silhouettes and the movements and the shadows. Um, so this is just another one that the light kind of dictated how I approached the image. Had I photographed the actual people, there would just be a bunch of silhouetted people playing basketball with a whole bunch of distraction in the beach background, trees, and some buildings and things like that. But this was just my way of taking something that was happening to create something visually striking. So this is from a recent proposal that I did in DC. When I started off the day, I had no idea I was going to make this photo. We were at the Lincoln Memorial, and we were walking through the wooded side of it, where there's a bunch of trees and shrubbery and grass and stuff. Part of actually Lincoln Memorial I've never really shot in. I usually shoot on the building and around the areas, but we're actually walking through the sides with trees and plants and shrubbery, and we walked into this area where it was really covered with a lot of trees and stuff, but the sun was setting and there were like pockets of light like shining through. And as I was walking, I like basically saw them, like the rays of light hit my face, like, oh, okay, there's one here. And I walked by and another one hit me, and I was like, okay, let me see what I could do here. Because it was dark, but there were these like rays of light, just pockets of light where orange sunlight was just popping through. So I just had them stand in the two different areas where the light was hitting. And I did I was shooting with my Leica M camera during this particular session. I think this was with my 35, I believe. I think this was my 35. Um, yeah, I think it was. And I just stopped down. I can't remember the f stop, but I stopped down to where I could get enough depth of field to cover both people on two different focal planes. And I just made the photo. Fortunately, and I just had them adjust their sides, like had them adjust their positioning to where the light only hit where I wanted it to hit. Like I had her move till her face was properly lit, and had it move to, and had them like just adjust as they move. Sometimes part of the face would like be dark, part of it would be light, but I had them just adjust themselves to where it properly lined up on the two different focal planes and two different beams of light that were hitting. So um, that's where this came from. Like light just presents itself, and sometimes you try things with it. You just try stuff, like you know and a lot of the times it works out, a lot of times it doesn't, but a lot of the times it does, and then you create something that's uniquely yours because the environment kind of decided to make that image. I just used you as the tool to make it. um, so that's where this came from, and this is how the light inspired this particular image. So here's one in Cuba again that is inspired by the light. So um, one of the things with street photography is it's called I think it's like setting a trap, right? So you first identify the scene, then you wait for something to happen in that scene that is interesting or complements the scene. This is a very simple image to make, in the sense that, as far as street photography is concerned, these are like probably one of the starter images you make as a street photographer, where you literally find a space you like, you sit and wait and camp, and then wait for someone to walk into the scene and you take their picture. That's usually one of the easiest pictures to make as starting off as a street photographer. It's probably one of the first ways you start to shoot in the streets. So this was actually during my first trip to Cuba, when I just got my Leica, and I went there to really put it to the test to decide to see if I really wanted to use that camera going forward, because it's really, being a rangefinder camera, and someone like me who actually didn't shoot film, started with digital, started on an iPhone, then transitioned to a DSLR. I really didn't have any photography history. Like I don't have history with film and any ties to analog or anything like that. So um, when I purchased the Leica M10 digital camera, I purchased it, for a different reason. I loved the way it felt in my hand. It's heavy. It felt like quality and all that kind of stuff. So I didn't really know that it was actually the camera for me as far as user experience. But I was like, okay, I'm gonna go to Cuba, the home of street photography. Or not the home, but the Mecca is the easiest place to make street photos because the streets, people are always on the streets doing interesting things. So I went there to test it out and decide if it was a camera for me. And you know, I was somewhere in Old Havana, and I found interesting light. It's just interesting, clean background with nice texture, and I like the diagonal lines from the shadows. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna stay here and I'm gonna wait for someone to walk through the scene. And I got several images of different people, but this one was cool because she had the cigarette in her mouth, and she fell right in where I wanted her to fall in the frame. Um, and I made this image, and I set the trap. I stayed there and I shot and I shot and I shot and I shot till the right person doing the right thing, or at least being interesting enough to be the one that I decided to keep, showed up, and I made that image. So this is just an example of how setting a trap or using that method to generate, to create a decent image is done. And you know, to make this one picture might take 20, 30 frames. It's not just the one shot, one image situation. So for anyone who's looking to do streets, that's a good way to start doing streets, is just find a nice scene, pre-compose it and wait till something happens. And if something happens that's really cool, then you have a really well composed moment versus trying to catch things as they happen, because then you're focused on catching the thing. You're not really looking at your composition. But if you can pre-compose and kind of anticipate something, then you end up with a really well-rounded photograph. So this is one of my favorite pictures of all time. And it's one of my favorite of all time because, you know, it has a lot of things in it that make for a really interesting photo. Again, the light. You see people, it has, nice highlights. It has nice shadows. It has people, it has silhouettes, it has properly, decently exposed people. And it has interesting color. And a lot of the colors you see are actually complementary colors. You see the red and the red and the yellow and the yellow, and you have the guy with the hats, and how the people who are silhouetted are like really well separated. Nobody's kind of overlapping, for the most part, with the heads and stuff. And this was one where so basically I'm shooting it's almost like a tunnel, right? So these guys were kind of under the tunnel, and some of the light, if you look at the bottom, you can see the shadows start to form from the top of the tunnel, but like a lot of the light from the outside is shining. And I really wanted to have the kids silhouetted, but also have people in the light, and have different layers of information. So I stayed behind them, so they're backlit and they're silhouetted, and I just kept shooting. And I have different frames of this image, by the way. And all of them were actually pretty good, but this is one of my favorite ones. And this one has actually been published in a magazine, a street photography festival magazine. And it just goes from understanding what I wanted to do based on the light that I had, and just shooting and framing and moving my composition around till I had things where I wanted it to be, and I just kept shooting through that. Just keep shooting and shooting and shooting, and eventually, the thing about street photography is you don't necessarily know what the picture you're trying to make is, but you know when you've made it. So a lot of the times you're just going off instinct, and you're playing with color, you're playing with light, you're playing with movement. But until the actual photo happens, you actually don't know what you're going for. So it's usually you shoot, and say, you know what, I think I got something. And it's when you go back to review your images, you identify the image that you made, that was the image you were going for, even though you didn't actually know what it was going to be. So that's one of the cool things about street is, you don't necessarily know what you're going to do or what you're planning to do or the image you're trying to make till it's made. Sometimes you do. If you're anticipating someone walking into a scene, you kind of know that's what you wanted them to do. But for other things, the more complex ones, you're really playing with light and color and shadow and composition and hoping that all these things come together to form something interesting. This is from a birthday portrait session. I was shooting in a backlit environment, and um, I figured I could do something different. Have my subject slightly silhouetted, had that highlight from the sun because the sun was coming from that direction, from the camera left, but slightly behind her, and you know, just do something a little bit stylistic. I have different versions of it. I have some with more of her dress, but this one I just liked how it filled the frame, so this is one I showed. But in this session, I used off-camera lighting. I used natural light. I used a whole bunch of things based on what direction I was facing. Um, and this one was just one where the light was just interesting and cool. So I created a silhouette, and that's how it's inspired this image. I like the blue sky behind her, and I was like, oh yeah, you have your balloons, and the wind is blowing. This is a perfect time to have the white balloons in the blue sky. You're black, so it's like blue, black, and white, like these really nice contrasty colors. And I figured it was a pretty decent photo. So, all right, so here's another street photo. This one was basically about highlights and shadows, and this is something I learned after Cuba. I really started to shoot highlights and shadows in street photography. So having really harsh light made my pictures made the photography, the day of photography more interesting for me, versus an overcast day, because I was able to play with these harsh lights and really deep shadows. And you know for me, I literally saw the contrast in the scene and exposed for it. So where I had the blacks really black and the highlights, well exposed, and just had this kid. This kid was using his scooter and just going around in a circle, like just going. I was like, oh, this is perfect. I'm going to camp here, frame for the light, and expose for the light, and just keep shooting till he falls right into this place where he's like about to enter into the abyss, the darkness, and it just worked out. Sometimes I wonder if people wonder how someone gets to a position where they can like just make this picture and it seems like very intentional. Um, and I wonder if they wonder if, oh, he just made it one take. No, it took time of just shooting and shooting while sometimes you just, the karma or like the universe knows what you're trying to do, and it just allows other people to fall in line to help you do it. So it's like they keep doing it repetitively to give you the chance to make the photo you're trying to make. And it just worked out. He kept going around. There were two of them. The other one is actually in the shadow, so you don't get to see him, based on how I exposed. But he just kept going and going and going, and I happened to grab it right where I needed it to be at this moment. And I think shortly after he stopped, so it totally worked out. Yeah, so this is just another one. So I'm gonna do one more after this. I just like this image, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit. And this was again directional light, harsh directional light. I love the contrast with the AirPods in his ear. A few people have said it looks like a Apple AirPod commercial, and could have been used for something like that. And I agree. I think it's very stylistic. This was done in Venice Beach as well during the workshop that we were hosting. I was shooting and saw this guy performing, and I just loved that he was facing the light. So I composed it this way and used some of the trees to give a little bit of context of place. and exposed for the highlights, because I love harsh light. I love dramatic images. That's just my thing. I love it when it's dramatic. I love harsh lights. I started off with photography, learning how to do one off camera flash harsh lights, so I could just black. I don't know if it's I guess I'm moody or emo like that, but like I love the darks and having it like very dramatic and moody. So I played with basically the direction it was facing and some of the surrounding environments, kind of like what inspired this image and how I composed it. I don't even recall having any other frame other than the frame in this direction. So as soon as I saw where he was facing and I saw those palm trees in the back, I just wanted to, create that composition. And I just went there and just shot that direction the whole time and got this image. So this is one that I like. Another one from Venice Beach. Actually, I will talk about one more after this. I know I said this might be the last one, but I'll talk about one more after this. This one I think is pretty self-explanatory. The light was where the light was, pretty somewhat backlit, somewhat, and the way it just fell on the shot on the ramp, and it just was so beautiful. I like that there's another photographer in the background doing what he's doing, and this guy's flying. He just gives some level of like scale. This actually was picked up by Leica. They shared this on their Instagram, and another one, but I didn't include that one in this because that one wasn't really about light. That was actually properly exposed, so you could see everything. There was no shadows or highlights. That was more about the shapes that I used in the composition. But yeah, this day I honestly was just finding interesting light and shadow. Um, and I like silhouettes because if everything else looks nice and the body language is great, you really don't need to see the details. It allows you to imagine yourself as the person in the photo versus seeing who they are. You could like put yourself in their shoes because they have no real face, they have no identity. So this is another one that I created that the lights kind of inspired. Now, I just recently finished curating the Fearless Awards 58, collection 58. And what I noticed after looking at thousands of pictures, over 15,000, I think collectively we all went through over 15,000 images. I had like several thousand, like 10,000 I looked at on my own, and picked awards from. What I noticed is people who win awards use things outside of typical wedding photography. They bring those things into their wedding photo photography, or they get highly technical or highly creative with how they show the typical things we see. For instance, I've seen a bouquet toss or garter toss, bouquet toss, where somebody's throwing the bouquet, but you don't see anybody that's catching it. You only see their shadows on the floor that's reaching for it, right? And I think that one won an award. So when you start to think outside the box and pull these different things into your weddings, the results you get are pretty incredible. And that's why I say that, photography is photography. You can make basic photography, expected photography, or you can make something that's out of the box and super, very captivating. So that's just an example. So in this picture, I'm playing with the rule of odds, right? 3 subjects, because usually visually that's more interesting. When you have odd number of subjects, 3, 5, the image just for some reason scientifically is more interesting, especially when you balance them out pretty well. So I have this trio going on, and what I like about this image is I have the lights on the red jacket, the red on the wall, those are complementing, right? I have the somewhat dark character in the right spot. He's in the figure of the ground, he's in the highlighted spot behind him, so he stands out, right? Then I have the shadow of the guy walking past the scene on the bottom, in the middle where he needs to be, highlighted. So these things just, even though it's so random how they happen, They all just happen to work at the right time when the frame is captured. And that to me is why street photography is very special, because you as the photographer really have no control over what happens. That when you do get that image that works, it's highly rewarding because you're not staging these photos. They're just occurring, and you kind of have a hunch about how you're going to approach them. And when it works, it's like amazing, right? So this is how the lights. This was taken in Vegas. I think you could probably see it in the back, and it was. I just felt so rewarded. It felt so rewarding when everything like fell into place and how it worked out. When I showed up to that spot, nobody was there. But all of a sudden, people just started walking through, and the guy in the bottom was walking through, and boom, everything lined up perfectly. Grabbed the shot, and it was great. So this is just one where, again, another one where lights is the inspiration for the photograph. But yeah, this is I think, I've gone through these. I know I did a little bit more street photography in this one because I feel like, as photographers, we should think as photographers and not as, oh, I'm a wedding photographer, I'm a documentary photographer. Like, we are photographers, so we should be able to shoot stuff and shoot everything creatively, and bring things from different genres of photography into the ones we're shooting. And I definitely bring my street into my weddings, and I bring my weddings into my street. A lot of my portraiture and the technicalities with which I shoot portraiture is how I also apply to street portraits that I make. I apply them to even like the way I compose. Some of the photos I compose in the street has that same aesthetic. So my aesthetic, I try to bring my aesthetic to everything, because I feel like it makes the images mine. And if you can bring different things to different areas, your images should stand out, versus just doing it how everybody else does it. So I hope this was interesting. I hope this was helpful. I will be making more videos for you guys, pretty soon. But I hope this worked. I hope this was interesting. I hope this helped in some way or inspired in some way. Please feel free to tell me things you're interested in hearing about. I talk about what I think is helpful or what I think helped me, or stuff like that. But please let me know if there's anything you see that I do that you like how I do it, to talk about it, and I will. Okay, so hope this was fun. Stay tuned for the next one. All right, thanks guys. Bye.